Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. 5 ordinary lives. 5 trusted relationships. 5 moments where everything went wrong. Tonight, we're going to walk through stories that don't just shock, they linger. They make you question the person sitting across from you at breakfast, the neighbor who waves from their driveway, the family name that's been carved into courthouse stones for generations. These aren't tales of strangers in dark alleys. These are stories about the people we let into our homes, into our beds, into our lives. And sometimes, that's the most dangerous decision we ever make. Before we begin, a necessary disclaimer. The names you'll hear tonight have been changed. The locations have been altered. Identifying details have been shifted to protect the privacy of survivors, families, and those still rebuilding their lives in the aftermath of unimaginable tragedy. But make no mistake, these events happened. The evidence is real. The verdicts are final. And the lessons, painful as they are, deserve to be remembered. Over the next 2.5 hours, we'll explore 5 cases that span the spectrum of human betrayal. A 911 call cut short by gunfire. A bedroom staged to look like suicide when it was anything but. A teenager who left for work one morning and never came home. A dynasty built on power and silence that finally crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. And a locked room mystery that haunted one detective for years until a single piece of evidence broke everything wide open. Each story is different. The warning signs are not. Let's begin where trust and violence collide in the most intimate space imaginable, the home. Daniel Cross was the kind of man people instinctively liked. In his early 30s, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen the world and come back with stories he didn't need to tell. His military service had taken him into explosive ordnance disposal, one of the most dangerous specializations in modern warfare. For years, Daniel had been the person called when objects needed to be rendered safe, when lives hung in the balance of steady hands and steadier nerves. But the job had taken its toll. A traumatic brain injury during his final deployment ended his career and sent him home with medical retirement papers and a future that suddenly looked very different from the one he'd imagined. He landed in Harbor Point, a coastal town in Florida where palm trees swayed against pastel skies and the smell of salt water hung thick in the humid air. It was the kind of place where people moved to start over, to find peace, to rebuild. Daniel threw himself into that rebuilding with characteristic determination. He enrolled in engineering school, balancing classes with being a devoted father to his 2 young children. Despite the headaches that came with his injury, despite the medications and the therapy appointments, he kept pushing forward. His professors described him as focused and diligent. His classmates knew him as the older guy who asked good questions and always showed up prepared. His children knew him as Dad, the one who helped with homework, who made them laugh, who was always there. Elena Cross was different in almost every way. Where Daniel had left military service behind, Elena was still very much in it. As an active-duty naval logistics officer, her life ran on schedules, protocols, and hierarchies. She was respected by her subordinates and her superiors alike. Disciplined, organized, the kind of person who could manage complex supply chains across multiple bases without breaking a sweat. Her career was ascending, and she carried that success with a certain pride. When she looked at Daniel, though, something had shifted. The man she'd married wasn't the man sitting across from her anymore. Or maybe she wasn't the woman who'd married him. Either way, the space between them was growing. The move to Harbor Point was supposed to help. A fresh start, a new community, a chance to recalibrate. But fresh starts don't erase old problems. They just give them new scenery. The arguments started small. Disagreements about the children's schedules, about money, about Daniel's mental health. Elena believed he wasn't taking his recovery seriously enough. Daniel believed Elena was trying to control every aspect of his life. Both felt unheard. Both felt wronged. And slowly, the tension in that house began to calcify into something harder, something meaner. Neighbors began to notice. Not because of screaming matches or broken windows, nothing that dramatic. But there was an energy around the Cross house that felt wrong. Cars in the driveway at odd hours. Voices raised just loud enough to carry through walls. a sense that behind the neat lawn and the closed blinds, something was fracturing. Some neighbors sympathized with Elena, saw her as a woman trying to hold her family together while dealing with a husband who'd changed. Others saw Daniel as a father doing his best in impossible circumstances, dealing with injuries that weren't his fault while being judged for every misstep. The police became familiar with the address. Wellness checks, mostly. Officers would arrive, knock on the door, ask if everything was all right. Both Daniel and Elena would assure them it was. Just a disagreement. Just stress. Nothing physical. And because there were no visible injuries, no weapons brandished, no immediate threats, the officers would note the call in their reports and leave. The system was doing what it was designed to do: respond to crises, document patterns, but stop short of intervention without concrete evidence of danger. No one could have known that the pattern being documented was a countdown. The night it happened was humid and dark, the kind of Florida evening where the air sits heavy on your skin and thunder rumbles somewhere in the distance without ever delivering rain. Inside the Cross House, another argument had erupted. The details of what sparked it would become a matter of court testimony and competing narratives, but the outcome was undisputed. At some point, Daniel retreated to the garage. Whether he went there to cool off, to escape, or because he felt unsafe would be debated later. What's certain is that the garage door closed behind him, and he found himself locked inside. At 11:47 p.m., a 911 call came through. The operator heard a male voice, low and urgent, speaking just above a whisper. "I'm in the garage. The door is locked. I can't get out. I think she has a gun. Please, I need." The call cut off. Not because the line went dead, but because the sound that came next made words irrelevant. Gunfire. Multiple shots. Rapid succession. Then silence. Police arrived within minutes. They found the garage door still locked from the outside. Inside, they found Daniel Cross. He'd been shot multiple times, every bullet entering from behind. There was no weapon near his body. There was no sign of struggle beyond the desperation of a man trying to escape. The children were in their rooms, confused and terrified. Elena was in the house, and she was taken into custody without incident. The trial that followed was clinical in its presentation of facts and devastating in its implications. Forensic experts testified about bullet trajectories, about the impossibility of self-inflicted wounds at those angles. Audio analysis of the 911 call captured not just Daniel's words, but the fear in his voice. Neighbors took the stand, describing the escalating tensions they'd witnessed. Elena's defense attorney attempted to paint a picture of a woman in fear for her life, a woman who'd been pushed to the edge by a husband whose brain injury had made him unpredictable, volatile. But the evidence wouldn't bend to fit that narrative. The shots to the back, the locked door, the recorded pleading, it all pointed in one direction. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down a life sentence. Elena Cross, once a respected naval officer, would spend the rest of her days in a Florida state prison. The children would grow up in foster care, their father dead and their mother imprisoned for killing him. And Daniel Cross, who'd survived bombs and battlefields only to die in his own garage, would never get to walk across the stage at his graduation. The university awarded him his engineering degree posthumously. His children kept the diploma. It's one of the only pieces of their father they have left. This story isn't told to assign blame beyond what the courts already decided. It's told because it illustrates something we don't like to admit. Domestic violence doesn't always come with black eyes and broken bones. Sometimes it escalates behind closed doors in ways that neighbors, friends, even trained professionals struggle to detect. Sometimes the person in danger is the one everyone assumes is fine. And sometimes, by the time we see the truth, it's already too late. But the betrayal of intimate partnership is only one kind. Sometimes, trust is destroyed not by passion or anger, but by something colder, something calculated. Sometimes, murder wears the mask of love while counting insurance money in the dark. Marcus Hale lived a life built on routine, and he seemed to like it that way. In his early 40s, he'd settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Coaching youth sports in North Prairie City, working a steady job, coming home to a blended family that appeared, from the outside, to be functioning well enough. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase excitement. Marcus was the guy who showed up on time, who remembered your kid's name, who helped carry equipment after practice without being asked. Reliable, solid, the kind of person communities depend on without quite realizing how much until they're gone. His marriage to Lydia Hale had its complexities, as most second marriages do. Both brought children from previous relationships. Both carried baggage from divorces that hadn't been easy, but they'd made it work for several years, navigating holidays and parenting disagreements and financial pressures with the kind of pragmatic partnership that doesn't make for romantic comedies but builds real lives. Or so it seemed. What no one saw was Lydia's relationship with Caleb Moore. It had started innocently enough, or at least that's how these things always start in the retelling. A friendship, someone to talk to, someone who listened in ways that made her feel seen again. But somewhere along the line, that friendship crossed into territory that required secrets. And secrets, once they take root, tend to grow in dark and twisted directions. Caleb Moore was younger than Lydia by almost a decade, which gave their relationship a certain energy that her marriage lacked. He was spontaneous where Marcus was predictable. He was exciting where Marcus was steady. And crucially, he was willing to entertain conversations that Marcus never would have. Conversations about what life could look like if certain obstacles weren't in the way. Conversations about money, about freedom, about starting fresh without the weight of obligations dragging you down. Conversations that, in hindsight, were never really hypothetical at all. The financial moves started subtly. Changes to insurance policies. Marcus's life insurance coverage was increased, not dramatically enough to raise immediate red flags, but significantly enough to matter. Lydia handled most of the household finances anyway, so Marcus signed where he was told to sign, trusting that his wife had their family's best interests at heart. And why wouldn't he? She was his partner. They'd built this life together. If she said they needed more coverage, he believed her. What Marcus didn't know was that Lydia and Caleb had been meeting regularly for months. Coffee shops on the edge of town where no one knew them. Parking lots late at night. Cheap motels where they paid cash and used fake names. They were careful, or they thought they were. But careful and invisible aren't the same thing. Security cameras have a way of remembering what human memory forgets. Receipts tell stories that lovers think they've erased. Digital footprints persist long after the people who made them have moved on. The plan, as it would later be reconstructed by investigators, was designed to look simple. Marcus would die in a way that appeared self-inflicted. Lydia would be the grieving widow, shocked and devastated by a tragedy no one saw coming. The insurance money would pay out. And after a respectful period of mourning, Lydia and Caleb could build the life they'd been fantasizing about in those late-night conversations. It was a fantasy built on selfishness and stupidity in equal measure, but fantasies have a way of feeling inevitable to the people inside them. On the night Marcus Hale died, he was in his own bedroom, in his own home, surrounded by everything familiar. That's where they found him the next morning. Lydia, specifically, who called 911 in a voice that operators would later describe as appropriately distressed but oddly controlled. She told the dispatcher that she'd woken up to find her husband dead, that it looked like he'd taken his own life, that she didn't understand, that he'd seemed fine the night before, that this didn't make any sense. The first officers on scene saw what Lydia wanted them to see, a tragic suicide. A man who'd apparently struggled with demons no one knew about. A devastated wife left to pick up the pieces. But those first impressions started crumbling almost immediately under the weight of details that didn't fit. The staging of the scene was clumsy. Someone had tried to make it look right, but didn't actually understand what right looked like. The position of Marcus's body didn't match the supposed cause of death. There were signs of a struggle that suicide wouldn't explain. And most damning of all, there were biological indicators suggesting Marcus hadn't died quite as peacefully or quickly as the scene suggested. Investigators started pulling threads. They looked at finances and found the insurance policy changes. They pulled phone records and found hours of calls and texts between Lydia and Caleb, many of them deleted from the phones themselves, but preserved in carrier databases. They pulled surveillance footage from businesses near the Hale house and found Caleb's vehicle in the area on the night of Marcus's death, despite his later claims that he'd been nowhere near there. Each piece of evidence was small on its own, but together they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. The most damning evidence came from the house itself. After Marcus was dead, someone had tried to start a fire in the bedroom, an amateur attempt to destroy forensic evidence, and make the scene even more chaotic. But the fire had failed to take hold properly. Instead of destroying evidence, it had preserved it in unexpected ways. Accelerant patterns told investigators where someone had poured liquid and where they'd stood while doing it. Burn patterns revealed the sequence of events. And crucially, DNA evidence survived in places the arsonist hadn't thought to worry about. When police arrested Lydia Hale, she maintained her innocence with the kind of conviction that might have been believable if there wasn't a mountain of evidence contradicting her. When they arrested Caleb Moore, his story started falling apart almost immediately. Under interrogation, faced with evidence he couldn't explain away, he made the calculation that criminals have been making since the beginning of time. He could save himself by giving up his partner. The plea deal he took in exchange for testimony against Lydia was a betrayal that mirrored the one they'd both committed against Marcus. There's a certain poetry in that, bitter as it is. The trial played out over several weeks, and the community watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. This wasn't some distant tragedy. Marcus Hale had coached their children. He'd been at their barbecues, their school events, their fundraisers, and Lydia had been right there beside him, smiling and social, and apparently planning his murder the whole time. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the monster revealed in a courtroom? The prosecution presented a case that was overwhelming in its detail. Financial motive established through insurance documents. Romantic motive established through thousands of messages between Lydia and Caleb. Opportunity established through timeline analysis and surveillance footage. And physical evidence tying both defendants to the scene and the crime. The defense tried to argue that Lydia had been manipulated by Caleb, that she was a victim herself in some twisted way. But the evidence showed a partnership of equals in guilt, two people who'd made a conscious choice to value their own desires over another person's life. Caleb Moore testified against Lydia as part of his plea agreement, describing in clinical detail the planning conversations, the night of the murder, the failed attempt to cover it up. His testimony was damning, but it also made clear that he was trying to minimize his own role while maximizing hers. The jury saw through it. They understood that both were guilty, that the only difference was who'd been smart enough to make a deal first. The verdict came back guilty on all counts for Lydia Hale. Murder in the first degree, conspiracy, arson. The judge showed no mercy in sentencing, handing down life without the possibility of parole. Caleb Moore, for his cooperation, received a sentence that would theoretically allow him to see freedom again someday, though that day is decades away. Neither sentence brings Marcus Hale back. Neither erases what his children lost or what his family endured. Justice was served in the legal sense, but justice never quite fills the hole that murder leaves behind. The community struggled to process it all. How had no one seen this coming? Were there signs that were missed? Could someone have intervened? These are the questions that haunt communities after crimes like this, and they're questions without satisfying answers. Because the truth is that people who plan murder are often very good at appearing normal. They go to work. They smile at neighbors. They live double lives with an ease that's terrifying in its ordinariness. And by the time the mask slips, it's usually too late for the person they were pretending to love. But betrayal doesn't always come from spouses or lovers. Sometimes it comes from the people we're taught to trust simply because they exist in proximity to our lives. Sometimes it comes from neighbors, from employers, from adults who position themselves as mentors and protectors while hiding intentions that are anything but protective. And sometimes that betrayal doesn't end with prison sentences. Sometimes it ends with someone who should have had a whole life ahead of them buried in a shallow grave. Emily Rowan was 17 years old and already certain about the direction her life would take. She wanted to work with animals. Specifically, she dreamed of becoming a veterinary technician, of spending her days helping creatures who couldn't help themselves. It was a dream born from genuine compassion, the kind of calling that some people feel from a young age and never shake. She'd already started preparing, taking relevant classes, volunteering at a local animal shelter on weekends, saving money from her part-time jobs to eventually fund the training program she'd need. In the meantime, she helped out neighbors with their pets, dog walking, pet sitting, basic care for people who worked long hours or traveled frequently. It was easy money, and it gave her practical experience. Plus, she liked the independence of it, the feeling that she was building something for herself. Her parents were supportive but cautious, the way parents of teenage daughters tend to be. They vetted the neighbors she worked for, made sure they knew where she'd be and when she'd be home. They did everything right, or at least everything they thought was right. Victor Lane lived 3 houses down and had known the Rowan family for years. In his late 50s, he ran a small contracting business that kept him comfortable, if not wealthy. He was the kind of neighbor who helped jumpstart dead batteries in winter and who remembered to bring in your trash cans if you were out of town. Friendly in that unobtrusive way that makes suburban life function smoothly. When Emily started her pet care side business, Victor was one of her first clients. He had 2 dogs and a cat, and he traveled for work often enough that regular help was genuinely useful. The relationship seemed perfectly appropriate at first. Emily would come by before or after school to let the dogs out, feed the animals, make sure everything was in order. Victor paid her fairly and on time. He was polite, respectful, grateful for the help. Emily's parents had no concerns. Why would they? This was a neighbor they'd known for years, someone whose reputation in the community was solid. If anything, they were glad Emily had found such reliable work close to home. But over time, small things began to shift. Victor started offering Emily gifts, nothing outrageous at first, just little things. A book about animal care he'd found and thought she might like. Some supplies for her volunteer work at the shelter. Gift cards to restaurants or stores, usually accompanied by explanations about how he'd received them as promotional items or gifts himself and wasn't going to use them anyway. Each gift came with a story that made it seem casual, thoughtless even. Not a transaction, just neighborly kindness. Emily accepted these gifts the way teenagers accept generosity from adults they're taught to trust, with gratitude and without suspicion. She mentioned them to her parents sometimes, though not always. The gifts didn't feel significant enough to report every single time, and besides, Mr. Lane was just being nice. That's what everyone thought. That's what he was counting on everyone thinking. The favors expanded too. Victor started asking Emily if she could help with small tasks beyond pet care. Could she water some plants? Could she grab his mail while he was out of town? Could she check on a repair he'd scheduled while he was at a job site? Each request was reasonable on its own. Each built on the established pattern of trust. And each gave Victor more access to Emily's time, more opportunities to normalize his presence in her life, more chances to blur the boundaries between employer and something else. Emily's parents noticed that she was spending more time helping Victor, but they didn't see cause for alarm. He was paying her for the extra work. She seemed fine. And frankly, they were busy with their own lives, their own jobs, their own concerns. This is not said to blame them. Every parent makes calculations about what level of monitoring is appropriate versus what level becomes helicopter parenting. They'd raised Emily to be independent and responsible. They trusted their community. Those are normal, reasonable parenting choices. The fact that they led to tragedy doesn't make them wrong in hindsight. It makes them heartbreaking. The day Emily disappeared started like any other. She'd finished her shift at her regular part-time job at a local grocery store around 6 p.m. She'd texted her mother to say she was going to stop by Mr. Lane's house to check on the dogs quickly before coming home for dinner. It was a routine stop, maybe 20 minutes of work. Her mother texted back a thumbs-up emoji and started preparing food, expecting Emily home within the hour. But Emily never came home. When she wasn't back by 7:30, her mother started texting. No response. She called. The phone rang, but no one answered. By 8 p.m., Emily's parents were in the car, driving the neighborhood, checking the grocery store, checking friends' houses. By 8:30, they were calling the police. By 9 p.m., a missing person report had been filed and officers were beginning to canvass the area. Emily's car was found the next morning, parked at a rest stop about 15 miles outside of town. The keys were still in the ignition. Her phone was on the passenger seat, battery dead. Her purse was there, wallet intact, nothing apparently stolen. The car itself showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. It was as if Emily had parked there, gotten out, and simply vanished. The initial theory, the one police floated to the media and the one Emily's parents refused to believe, was that she'd run away. 17-year-old girl, car found abandoned, no sign of foul play. Maybe she'd met someone online. Maybe she'd been planning this. Maybe she was already in another state, living some life her parents knew nothing about. It's a theory that gets deployed often in cases of missing teenagers, and sometimes it's even true. But Emily's parents knew their daughter. They knew her dreams, her plans, her routines. She hadn't run away. Something had happened to her. The community organized search parties. Volunteers combed through woods and fields. Posters went up on every telephone pole and storefront window. Local news covered the disappearance extensively. Tips came in, possible sightings, suspicious vehicles, theories ranging from plausible to absurd. None of them led anywhere. As days turned into weeks, the initial urgency began to fade for everyone except Emily's family. The media moved on to other stories. The search parties grew smaller. Life, as it has a cruel tendency to do, continued for everyone except the people who'd lost someone. But the investigation didn't stop, even as public attention waned. Detectives continued working the case, re-interviewing witnesses, checking and rechecking timelines. They built a detailed picture of Emily's final day, tracing her movements from school to work too, and that's where it got fuzzy. The text to her mother said she was going to Victor Lane's house. Had she actually made it there? Victor said no. He claimed he hadn't seen Emily that day, that she must have changed her plans. But his story had inconsistencies, small ones at first, times that didn't quite match up, details that shifted between tellings. Nothing dramatic enough to justify an arrest, but enough to keep investigators circling back. 3 months after Emily disappeared, a cadaver dog alerted on Victor Lane's property during a routine search of the neighborhood. The dog's handler called for backup immediately. By the next morning, forensic teams were excavating an area behind Victor's detached garage, a corner of his yard where the ground showed signs of having been disturbed and then carefully disguised. They found Emily Rowan buried less than 4 feet down, wrapped in plastic sheeting, covered with dirt and landscaping stones that had been precisely arranged to look natural. The discovery brought Emily's family the worst kind of closure, the kind where hope dies and grief becomes concrete. And it brought investigators the evidence they needed to bring murder charges against the neighbor who'd been lying to them for months. Victor Lane's story fell apart under interrogation. Faced with physical evidence tying Emily's remains to his property, faced with forensic analysis showing she died on the day she disappeared, faced with phone records and witness statements that contradicted every lie he told, he finally admitted what had happened. The confession, when it came, was clinical and self-serving. The words of a man trying to minimize his culpability even as he acknowledged his crime. According to Victor, Emily had come to his house that evening as planned. He'd asked her to help him with something in the garage. She'd agreed. Why wouldn't she? He was someone she trusted, someone she'd been working for regularly. But once they were alone, Victor had made advances that had nothing to do with pet care or neighborly favors. Emily had rejected those advances immediately and unequivocally. She tried to leave. Victor, in his telling, had panicked. He'd grabbed her. She'd struggled. He'd used physical force to restrain her. And in the struggle, Emily Rowan had died. The details Victor provided made clear that this wasn't a split-second loss of control. The struggle had gone on for some time. Emily had fought for her life. Victor had made conscious choices at multiple points, to escalate force, to continue when she was clearly terrified, to silence her permanently rather than let her go and face consequences. After Emily was dead, Victor had methodically disposed of her body, cleaned up evidence, moved her car to a location designed to suggest she'd left voluntarily, and then spent months lying to investigators, to neighbors, to Emily's grieving parents. The prosecution's case painted a picture even darker than Victor's confession suggested. This hadn't been an impulsive crime. The grooming had been deliberate. The gifts, the boundary violations, the isolation of Emily from oversight. Victor had been building towards something for months, creating conditions where he had access and opportunity. When Emily finally rejected him definitively, he'd killed her rather than accept that rejection, and he'd almost gotten away with it. The trial was devastating. Emily's parents had to sit through descriptions of their daughter's final moments. They had to hear Victor's defense attorney try to paint Emily as somehow complicit in her own murder, suggesting she'd encouraged Victor's attention or sent mixed signals. They had to watch Victor himself take the stand and express what sounded like remorse, but felt more like self-pity, talking about his own suffering and how mistakes were made, as if he were discussing a business error rather than the deliberate murder of a teenage girl. The jury saw through it all. They convicted Victor Lane of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. In his statement before sentencing, the judge spoke directly to the Rowan family, acknowledging that no sentence could ever be adequate, that Emily's death was a hole in the world that would never be filled. He spoke about the trust Victor had violated, about the calculated nature of his crime, about the fact that he'd used his position as a trusted neighbor to access and ultimately destroy a young life. Emily Rowan should have graduated high school that spring. She should have started her veterinary technician training. She should have spent years helping animals and building the life she'd dreamed about. Instead, she's buried in a cemetery on the edge of town, and her parents visit her grave every week with flowers and grief that time has softened but never erased. The warning in Emily's case isn't subtle or complex. It's brutally simple. Familiarity doesn't equal safety. The neighbor who seems helpful might be building a predatory relationship. The adult who gives gifts might be buying access and silence. And teenagers, who are naturally inclined to trust authority figures and established community members, are particularly vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. Emily's parents did nothing wrong by trusting a longtime neighbor, but that trust was weaponized against their daughter. And the lesson for all of us is that trust should always come with boundaries, with oversight, with the understanding that not every friendly face has friendly intentions. But sometimes betrayal operates on a completely different scale. Sometimes it's not a neighbor, but an entire family structure built on corruption and maintained through power. Sometimes justice is delayed not by evidence gaps, but by influence that's been accumulating for generations. And sometimes the fall, when it finally comes, takes down everything it touches. The Whitmore family name had been engraved on Lowland County for over a century. Not literally, though there were certainly buildings and monuments bearing the name. But the Whitmores had written themselves into the fabric of local power in ways that made them seem permanent, inevitable even. The family had produced judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and politicians across multiple generations. They owned significant property throughout the county. They sat on boards, funded campaigns, influenced appointments. When people in Lowland County talked about power, the Whitmore name was part of that conversation automatically. Richard Whitmore represented the current generation of that dynasty. In his 60s, he'd inherited not just wealth, but the accumulated influence of every Whitmore who'd come before him. He'd practiced law for decades, mostly civil work that kept prominent clients happy and generated substantial fees. But Richard's real power came from connections, from favors owed and leverage accumulated, from the kind of social capital that money alone can't buy. He lived on the family estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of town that had been in Whitmore hands since the early 1900s. The estate was private, gated, the kind of place where outsiders weren't welcome unless specifically invited. And what happened behind those gates was considered family business, which in Lowland County meant it was off limits to scrutiny. But even the most carefully maintained facades develop cracks eventually. And the Whitmore facade had been cracking for years. People just hadn't been looking closely enough to notice. The first signs were financial. Lawsuits filed against Whitmore business interests that settled quickly and quietly, with non-disclosure agreements ensuring no details ever became public. Partnerships that dissolved with unusual speed. Investors who pulled out of deals without clear explanation. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, but a pattern that suggested something unstable beneath the surface of apparent prosperity. Then there were the deaths. A business partner of Richard's had died in what was ruled an accidental fall from his own roof. An employee who'd threatened to go public with concerns about financial irregularities had died in a single-vehicle car accident on a clear day on a road he'd driven thousands of times. A distant Whitmore relative who'd been cut out of inheritance distributions had died from what appeared to be a self-inflicted overdose, though people who knew her insisted she'd never shown signs of depression or substance abuse. Each death, taken individually, could be explained away as tragedy or coincidence. But taken together, they formed a pattern that made some people uncomfortable, even if no one was quite willing to say so publicly. The reason no one spoke up was simple. The Whitmores had power, and power in a small county translates to consequences. Speak against them, and suddenly your business permits get delayed. Your legal troubles get more complicated. Your reputation gets quietly destroyed through whisper campaigns you can't trace back to a source. It wasn't overt intimidation. That would be too crude. It was the subtle pressure of a system that had been built to serve certain interests, and the Whitmores had spent generations ensuring they were among those interests. But families this powerful often contain their own seeds of destruction. Richard Whitmore's wife, Catherine, had grown increasingly isolated over the years of their marriage. Friends she'd had before marrying into the family had drifted away or been pushed away. She rarely appeared in public anymore, rarely left the estate. When she did, people who saw her noticed she seemed diminished somehow, smaller and quieter than the vibrant woman who'd married Richard decades ago. Some attributed it to age or health issues. Others wondered if something darker was happening behind the estate's gates. Richard's son, Michael, was another crack in the facade. In his late 30s, Michael had failed to live up to the Whitmore name in the ways that mattered to Richard. He'd tried practicing law but lacked his father's ruthlessness. He'd tried business ventures but lacked the necessary discipline. What he had succeeded at was drinking too much, making scenes at county social functions, and generally embodying everything Richard despised about weakness and failure. Their relationship was tense at best, hostile at worst, and everyone who knew the family knew that Michael's position was increasingly precarious. The incident that would ultimately unravel everything happened on a rainy autumn evening. Michael had been driving back to the estate after an afternoon at a bar. Not his first drink of the day, and certainly not his last planned. His judgment was impaired, his reflexes slow. When a local college student stepped into the crosswalk near campus, Michael's brain processed the information too late. He struck the student at a speed that didn't give the young man a chance. The impact killed him almost instantly. Michael panicked. Instead of stopping, instead of calling for help, he drove away. The student's body wasn't discovered until morning. Witnesses had seen a vehicle fleeing the scene but hadn't gotten a clear description. Campus security footage captured blurry images of a car that could have been any of several models. Initially, investigators had nothing concrete to go on, but they had suspicion. They knew Michael Whitmore's reputation for drinking. They knew he'd been in town that day, and when they examined his vehicle, with a warrant that took unusual effort to obtain, given the family's connections, they found damage consistent with striking a pedestrian, along with attempts to repair and clean that damage. The case should have been straightforward from there. Arrest, prosecution, justice for a young man whose life had been stolen by someone's drunk driving and cowardice. Instead, things got complicated. Richard Whitmore activated every connection he had. Prosecutors who owed favors suddenly found reasons to doubt the evidence. Judges who'd been appointed with Whitmore's support ruled in ways that hampered the investigation. Witnesses became reluctant to testify. The student's family found themselves pressured to accept a settlement and stay quiet. It was a masterclass in how power can corrupt justice, and it might have worked if Richard hadn't made a fatal miscalculation. He'd assumed that protecting Michael was his top priority, that maintaining the family name and reputation justified any action. What he hadn't calculated was that the pressure and stress of the situation, combined with his own controlling nature, would push his already unstable family dynamic past the breaking point. Or maybe he had calculated it and simply didn't care. Either way, what happened next changed everything. Catherine Whitmore and her son Michael were found dead on the estate on a cold January morning. The person who discovered them was household staff, arriving for a routine day of work and finding instead a scene of violence that would haunt them forever. Catherine had been shot multiple times. Michael had been shot multiple times. The bodies were in different parts of the estate, suggesting they'd been killed separately. And Richard Whitmore's alibi, that he'd been away on business, immediately drew scrutiny. Richard claimed he'd been in the state capitol meeting with business associates when his wife and son were murdered. He provided names, receipts, hotel records. But investigators weren't buying it, and this time, the Whitmore name couldn't shut down the investigation. This was double murder. This was national news. This was too big to suppress, too visible to manipulate through quiet influence. The digital evidence told a different story than Richard's alibi. Cell phone location data placed Richard's phone at the estate during the time frame when the murders occurred, not at the Capitol where he claimed to be. Security footage from the estate, which Richard had tried to claim was malfunctioning, had actually been deliberately disabled, but not before capturing images of Richard's vehicle on the property. Financial records showed that Richard had transferred large sums of money into accounts he thought were untraceable, money that investigators believed was meant to fund his planned escape after murdering his family. The prosecution's theory, supported by mounting evidence, was that Richard had decided to eliminate the threats to his power and reputation. Catherine had known too much about his business dealings and had become increasingly unstable, increasingly likely to talk. Michael had become a liability, his involvement in the hit-and-run a problem that Richard couldn't fully control despite all his efforts. Rather than continue managing these threats, Richard had chosen permanent solutions. The fact that these threats were his wife and son apparently didn't matter to him. Or maybe it did, and he'd simply calculated that preserving his empire was worth any cost, including their lives. But murder investigations, especially high-profile ones, have a way of uncovering more than just the immediate crime. As detectives dug into Richard Whitmore's finances, they found evidence of massive fraud stretching back decades. Money laundering through various Whitmore business entities. Tax evasion on a scale that was almost impressive in its audacity. Bribery of public officials, documented in emails and financial records that Richard had believed were secure. It was a catalog of corruption that painted the Whitmore dynasty not as a pillar of the community, but as a criminal enterprise that had successfully masqueraded as legitimate power. The connections to previous suspicious deaths also became clearer. That business partner who'd fallen from his roof? He'd been investigating financial irregularities in a joint venture with Richard just before his death. The employee who'd died in the car accident? She'd been preparing to blow the whistle on fraudulent billing practices. The relative who'd supposedly overdosed? She'd been threatening to sue over estate distributions she believed were unlawful. None of this could be proven conclusively enough to bring murder charges for those deaths, but it established a pattern that made Richard's guilt in the deaths of his wife and son even more certain. The trial was everything the Whitmores had spent generations avoiding: public, transparent, and utterly devastating to the family name. Richard's defense team, though well-funded and aggressive, couldn't overcome the digital evidence, the financial records, the testimony from former associates who'd finally found the courage to speak. The jury convicted Richard Whitmore of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge handed down 2 life sentences to be served consecutively. Richard Whitmore, who'd spent his entire life wielding power over others, would die in prison. But the consequences extended far beyond Richard's individual conviction. The exposure of the family's decades of corruption triggered investigations into numerous other cases. Past legal decisions were reviewed. Contracts and business deals were audited. Politicians who'd received Whitmore money found themselves under scrutiny. It was a controlled demolition of an empire, and it left Lowland County fundamentally changed. The Whitmore estate was seized to pay restitution and fines. The family name, once synonymous with power, became synonymous with corruption. And the lesson was clear: no one, no matter how powerful or connected, is truly above the law, though some can delay justice for longer than others. The fall of the Whitmore dynasty serves as a reminder that power built on corruption is ultimately unstable. Richard Whitmore had believed that his wealth, his connections, and his family name made him untouchable. He believed that he could literally get away with murder, that the systems he'd spent decades manipulating would continue to protect him even when he committed the most heinous crimes imaginable. He was wrong. And while justice for Catherine and Michael Whitmore came too late for them, it came nonetheless. Their deaths, tragic as they were, finally exposed the rot at the heart of a family that had been poisoning its community for generations. But not all cases involve family dynasties or elaborate conspiracies. Sometimes the complexity comes not from the crime itself, but from the challenge of proving it. Sometimes justice is delayed not by corruption, but by the simple, frustrating reality that evidence is missing and witnesses are silent, and the truth is locked away where no one can reach it. Until suddenly, it isn't. Nathan Cole was charming in the way that certain people are, effortlessly, naturally, as if charisma was just another feature like height or eye color. In his mid-30s, he worked in pharmaceutical sales, a job that suited his personality perfectly. He talked to doctors, convinced them to prescribe his company's products, made his quotas consistently, and earned a comfortable living. Outside of work, Nathan lived in a modern apartment complex in Silver Bay City, the kind of place populated by young professionals who valued location and amenities over space. He dated frequently, never seemed to be in one relationship for too long, and maintained friendships with an ease that made him popular in his social circles. What people around Nathan didn't fully realize was that his romantic life was more complicated than it appeared. Nathan wasn't just casually dating. He was simultaneously involved with multiple women, none of whom knew about the others. It was a high-wire act of scheduling and deception, maintained through burner phones, carefully compartmentalized social media, and a talent for lying that came disturbingly naturally. To each woman, Nathan presented himself as committed, interested in a future together, sincere in his affections. The reality was that Nathan viewed relationships as transactions, as sources of validation and pleasure that required minimal investment on his part. One of these women was Rachel Monroe, who lived in the same apartment complex. She and Nathan had been seeing each other for several months, though Rachel believed the relationship was more serious than Nathan did. She'd introduced him to friends, talked about moving in together, made plans for a future that Nathan had no intention of honoring. When Nathan began pulling away, taking longer to respond to messages, being vague about his availability, showing clear signs of disinterest, Rachel had reacted the way many people do when relationships start to dissolve, with confusion, then frustration, then anger. There had been arguments between them in the weeks before Nathan's death. Neighbors heard raised voices from Rachel's apartment. Complex security cameras captured tense conversations in parking lots and hallways. Rachel had confronted Nathan about other women she discovered he was seeing. Nathan had been dismissive, even cruel in his responses. He'd told Rachel she was overreacting, that they'd never been exclusive despite what she believed, that she needed to move on. For someone who'd invested emotionally in what she thought was a meaningful relationship, those words had been devastating. The night Nathan Cole died, he was alone in his apartment. That much was certain. No one saw anyone enter or leave his unit during the relevant time frame. When his body was discovered 2 days later, by a colleague who'd become concerned when Nathan missed work without calling, the scene was perplexing. Nathan was dead from a single gunshot wound, but there was no weapon in the apartment. All the doors and windows were locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle. It was as if Nathan had been killed and the murder weapon had simply vanished. The initial investigation focused on the obvious suspects, the women Nathan had been involved with, but each of them had alibis for the time of death. More frustratingly, without a murder weapon, without any physical evidence tying anyone to the scene, the case stalled. Detectives interviewed everyone in Nathan's life, examined his finances, searched for threats or conflicts that might have escalated to murder. They found plenty of people who had reason to be angry with Nathan. He'd left a trail of hurt and betrayed women. But anger isn't evidence, and suspicion isn't proof. The case went cold, not officially, but practically. Detectives moved on to more active investigations with better evidence trails. Nathan Cole's murder file went into a box, and that box went onto a shelf, and life continued for everyone except Nathan and the person who'd killed him. But one detective couldn't let it go. Leon Marks was in his late 40s, a veteran investigator with the kind of career that had seen enough bodies and enough grief to make most people cynical. But Leon had maintained something that many of his colleagues lost over the years, a belief that every victim deserved justice, that every case deserved to be solved, that giving up on a murder was giving up on the fundamental promise that law enforcement makes to its community. So while the Nathan Cole case officially went cold, Leon kept it warm. He'd pull the file on slow days, review the evidence, look for connections or patterns that previous reviews had missed. His wife joked that he was obsessed. His partner worried that he was wasting time. Leon didn't care. Something about the locked room bothered him, the impossible nature of the scene. Murders didn't happen by magic. There was always evidence. Always. They just hadn't found it yet. 3 years after Nathan's death, a routine maintenance issue at the apartment complex led to an unexpected discovery. A plumber working on a drainage problem in the building's exterior wall system found something that didn't belong. A handgun, wrapped in plastic, wedged into a space that was accessible only from one specific apartment. That apartment belonged to Rachel Monroe. The weapon was tested. The serial numbers had been filed off, but not well enough to prevent forensic recovery. The gun was registered to Rachel Monroe's brother, who reported it stolen months before Nathan's death, a report that Rachel had filed on his behalf. Ballistics testing confirmed what Leon Marks had suspected for years. This was the weapon that had killed Nathan Cole. And suddenly, the impossible crime scene made sense. Rachel hadn't been inside Nathan's apartment when she killed him. She'd shot him through the wall. The apartments in that complex were cheaply constructed, with thin walls and minimal sound insulation, something residents complained about regularly. Rachel's apartment shared a wall with Nathan's, and the layout was such that Rachel would have known exactly where Nathan's living room was, where he typically sat when he was home. On the night she killed him, Rachel had positioned herself on her side of that shared wall, pressed the gun against the drywall, and fired. The bullet had passed through both walls and struck Nathan, killing him almost instantly. Then Rachel had hidden the weapon in a place she believed would never be discovered and waited. The genius of it, in a cold and calculated way, was that it eliminated most of the problems that usually trip up murderers. No one saw her enter or leave Nathan's apartment because she never went there. There were no fibers, no DNA, no trace evidence connecting her to the crime scene because she'd never been at the crime scene. The locked doors and windows weren't mysterious. They'd been locked because Nathan had locked them himself before he was killed. And the missing weapon could never be found through normal investigation because normal investigation focused on Nathan's apartment, not on the walls around it. But Rachel hadn't counted on maintenance issues. She hadn't anticipated that years later, someone would have reason to dig into the walls and find what she'd hidden. And she certainly hadn't anticipated that Detective Leon Marks would still be working the case, still looking for that one piece of evidence that would break everything open. When police arrested Rachel Monroe, she initially maintained her innocence with the same conviction she'd shown for 3 years. But faced with the recovered weapon, faced with forensic evidence of the bullet's trajectory, faced with testimony from building maintenance about exactly where the gun had been hidden and which apartment had access to that hiding spot, her story fell apart. Her attorney tried to build a defense around temporary insanity, around emotional distress caused by Nathan's treatment of her. But the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. This hadn't been a crime of passion. Rachel had stolen her brother's gun months in advance. She'd filed a false police report to cover that theft. She'd calculated the angle and position needed to shoot through a wall. She'd planned the murder and executed it with chilling precision. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman so consumed by rejection and rage that she decided murder was an appropriate response. They introduced evidence of Rachel's increasingly obsessive behavior in the months before Nathan's death. Text messages that escalated from pleading to threatening, social media posts that suggested deteriorating mental health, witness testimony about Rachel's stated belief that if she couldn't have Nathan, no one should. It was a portrait of obsession that had curdled into lethal intent. The defense tried to generate sympathy for Rachel, to position her as a victim of Nathan's manipulations who'd been pushed beyond reason. And certainly, Nathan Cole was no angel. The trial revealed the full extent of his deceptions, the multiple women he'd been stringing along, the callousness with which he'd treated people who trusted him. But being a bad boyfriend doesn't carry a death sentence. Nathan's flaws, significant as they were, didn't justify what Rachel had done to him. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The question wasn't really whether Rachel had killed Nathan. The evidence was too strong to dispute. The question was whether the murder had been premeditated or the result of diminished capacity. In the end, the jury concluded that someone who plans a murder for months, who acquires a weapon and files false reports and calculates bullet trajectories, is someone capable of forming intent regardless of their emotional state. They convicted Rachel Monroe of first-degree murder. The judge's sentencing statement acknowledged the complexity of the case. He spoke about how Nathan's treatment of Rachel didn't excuse her actions, but did provide context for understanding how someone without a violent history could reach a point of committing murder. He spoke about the importance of recognizing warning signs in deteriorating mental health and the need for better resources to help people before they reach crisis points. But he also spoke about the finality of murder, about how Rachel's choice to kill Nathan had eliminated any possibility of healing, of resolution, of moving forward. He sentenced Rachel to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Detective Leon Marks attended the sentencing. He'd spent 3 years of his life on a case that many of his colleagues thought was unsolvable. The vindication must have felt good, but when asked about it later, Leon said something that stuck with the people who heard it. He said that solving a murder doesn't feel like winning. It feels like finally being able to give a family answers, to close a wound that's been bleeding for years. Nathan Cole's family got those answers. They got justice in the legal sense. But Leon understood that nothing he did, no arrest or conviction or sentence, would bring Nathan back or erase the trauma his death had caused. The Nathan Cole case illustrates something important about the nature of justice. It requires persistence. Some cases solve themselves quickly. The evidence is clear, the suspect obvious, the prosecution straightforward. But other cases require someone to refuse to give up, to keep looking when everyone else has moved on, to believe that the truth is discoverable even when it seems impossible. Leon Marks was that person for Nathan Cole. And while the resolution came too late to prevent years of uncertainty for Nathan's family, it came nonetheless. Sometimes that has to be enough. These 5 stories, different as they are in their specifics, share common threads that are worth examining. They're all stories about trust that was betrayed. Daniel Cross trusted that his wife, despite their problems, wouldn't kill him. Marcus Hale trusted that his wife and her lover wouldn't murder him for insurance money. Emily Rowan trusted the neighbor who'd seemed kind and dependable. Catherine and Michael Whitmore trusted, on some level, that family bonds would provide protection. Nathan Cole trusted that the locked door of his apartment would keep him safe. In each case, that trust was not just misplaced, but weaponized against them. There are also stories about how violence hides behind ordinary facades. None of these murderers looked like monsters before they killed. Elena Cross was a respected naval officer. Lydia Hale and Caleb Moore were community members living normal lives. Victor Lane was the helpful neighbor. Richard Whitmore was a powerful attorney from a prestigious family. Rachel Monroe was a woman dealing with heartbreak. If we're waiting for murderers to announce themselves clearly, to wear their intentions obviously, we'll miss the warning signs every time. And there's stories about systems that sometimes fail to protect people until it's too late. The police who responded to wellness checks at the Cross house couldn't intervene without evidence of immediate danger. The community that trusted Victor Lane couldn't have known his true intentions without investigating suspicions that seemed too dark to voice. The law enforcement and legal systems that the Whitmores had corrupted for decades couldn't be reformed until the corruption was exposed. The investigators who worked Nathan Cole's case couldn't solve it until evidence that had been carefully hidden was accidentally discovered. These aren't failures of individual officers or prosecutors or community members. They're limitations built into systems that have to balance protection with civil liberties, suspicion with evidence, intervention with overreach. But perhaps the most important common thread is the one that runs through the aftermath of each case: the permanent damage done to survivors. Daniel Cross's children lost both parents in one night and will carry that trauma forever. Marcus Hale's children watched their family implode in the most public way possible. Emily Rowan's parents lost their daughter and had to live with the knowledge that the person who killed her was someone they trusted. The Lowland County community lost faith in institutions that had governed them for generations. Nathan Cole's family spent 3 years not knowing who'd killed their son or whether justice would ever come. These are wounds that never fully heal. Convictions and sentences provide a measure of closure, but they don't restore what was taken. Let's return to Daniel Cross's story for a moment, because there are details worth examining that illuminate how domestic violence can escalate in ways that evade traditional warning signs. Daniel's traumatic brain injury wasn't just a medical condition. It became a weapon in the narrative that surrounded his death. Elena's defense attorney tried to use it to paint Daniel as unpredictable, potentially violent, someone Elena had reason to fear. But the medical evidence didn't support that characterization. Daniel's injury affected his cognitive processing in specific ways, caused headaches and fatigue, required medication and management. What it didn't do was make him violent. What it didn't do was justify his murder. The problem with using mental health or medical conditions as post hoc justifications for violence is that it stigmatizes everyone living with those conditions. The vast majority of people with traumatic brain injuries never harm anyone. The vast majority of people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. When we allow those conditions to be used as explanations for murder, especially when the evidence contradicts that explanation, we reinforce dangerous stereotypes and make it harder for people to seek help without fear of being labeled as dangerous. Daniel's 911 call is particularly haunting when you listen to the audio, which was played during the trial. His voice is quiet, controlled despite obvious fear. He's trying not to be overheard. He's trying to get help without escalating the situation. I'm in the garage. The door is locked. I can't get out. I think she has a gun. Please, I need. And then the shots. Multiple shots. Rapid succession. No hesitation between them. That's not someone firing in panic or self-defense. That's someone who's made a decision and is following through with it. The forensic evidence confirmed what the audio suggested. All the shots entered Daniel's back. He wasn't facing Elena when she shot him. He was trying to get away. Some of the wounds were consistent with him being on the ground when they were inflicted. The crime scene reconstruction showed that Daniel had been attempting to break through the locked garage door when he died, using tools that were found near his body. He was fighting for his life up until the moment that life ended. Elena's story changed multiple times before and during the trial. Initially, she claimed Daniel had locked himself in the garage and that she'd heard gunshots but hadn't known what happened. When that story collapsed under evidence, she claimed self-defense, saying Daniel had threatened her and she'd fired through the garage door in fear. When forensic evidence disproved that version, her attorney pivoted to diminished capacity, arguing that years of stress and fear had pushed Elena to a breaking point. But the jury heard all of it. The shifting stories, the evidence that contradicted each version, the methodical nature of the shooting, and they concluded what seemed obvious. Elena Cross had murdered her husband deliberately, and her attempts to avoid accountability were just additional layers of betrayal. The Cross children, who are now being raised by relatives, will grow up knowing that their mother killed their father. That's a burden no child should carry. Therapy can help them process it. Family can provide support. Time can soften the sharpest edges of trauma. But they'll never get back the childhood they should have had. They'll never get back the father who was working so hard to build a future for them. And they'll carry forever the knowledge that the person who should have protected them was the person who destroyed their family. Marcus Hale's case reveals a different kind of betrayal, the kind driven not by rage or fear, but by cold calculation and greed. Lydia Hale and Caleb Moore didn't kill Marcus in a moment of passion. They planned it over months, discussing methods, timing, logistics. They researched how to make murder look like suicide. They considered and rejected various approaches before settling on their final plan. This was murder as project management, with checklists and contingencies and goals. The insurance policies were the most damning evidence of premeditation. Lydia had increased Marcus's coverage substantially in the months before his death. When investigators looked at the paperwork, they found that Lydia had filled out the applications, had listed herself as the primary beneficiary, had even forged Marcus's signature on some of the documents. Marcus, who trusted his wife to handle family finances, had no idea his life had been valued and his death had been monetized. The text messages between Lydia and Caleb, recovered from phone company databases even after both had deleted them from their devices, read like a twisted love story with murder as the climax. Early messages were flirtatious, excited, full of the energy that comes with new relationships. But over time, the messages turned darker. Discussions about Marcus not as a person, but as an obstacle. Calculations about how much money the insurance would pay out. Fantasies about the life they'd build together once Marcus was out of the way. One message in particular stood out during the trial. Lydia had texted Caleb, "After it's done, we wait 6 months minimum. Has to look right. Then we're free." That single message encapsulated the entire conspiracy. The murder, the insurance motive, the plan to pretend grief while waiting for an appropriate time to cash in and start their new life together. It was cold, businesslike, devoid of any recognition that they were talking about killing a human being, someone Lydia had promised to love and honor. The night of the murder, Caleb had driven to the Hale house while Marcus slept. Lydia had let him in. Together, they'd killed Marcus in his own bed, then staged the scene to look like suicide. The staging was amateurish at best. Anyone with actual forensic knowledge would have spotted the inconsistencies immediately. But Lydia and Caleb weren't experts. They were just two people who'd convinced themselves that murder was acceptable if the payoff was big enough, and who'd vastly overestimated their own cleverness. The failed arson attempt was perhaps the most damning evidence of their incompetence. After killing Marcus, they tried to set the bedroom on fire, apparently hoping that flames would destroy any forensic evidence that contradicted their suicide story. But they'd done it wrong, using too little accelerant, placing it incorrectly, failing to understand how fire actually behaves. The result was smoke and minor damage, but no actual fire, an accelerant residue that made investigators immediately suspicious. If they'd simply left the scene alone, they might have had a better chance of getting away with it. Instead, their attempt to be clever became the evidence that sealed their fate. Caleb Moore's decision to testify against Lydia was predictable in its selfishness. When faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of life in prison, he made the calculation that saving himself was more important than loyalty to his co-conspirator. His testimony was detailed and incriminating, describing every planning conversation, every step of the murder, every moment of the cover-up attempt. He tried to position himself as less culpable, suggesting that Lydia had been the driving force and he'd just gone along with it. But the evidence showed equal participation. The text messages revealed joint planning. The forensic evidence showed both of them at the scene. Caleb's attempt to minimize his role came across as exactly what it was: a desperate man trying to reduce his sentence at his partner's expense. The prosecution's closing argument in the Marcus Hale case was particularly powerful. The prosecutor stood before the jury and asked them to consider what Marcus's final moments must have been like. Waking up in his own bed to find the two people who'd betrayed him there to kill him. Realizing that his wife, the person he'd built a life with, had chosen to end that life for money. Understanding in those final seconds that trust had meant nothing, that love had been a lie, that his death had been planned and calculated like a business transaction. The prosecutor asked the jury to remember that Marcus Hale had been a real person with hopes and plans and people who loved him, and that Lydia and Caleb had extinguished all of that for their own selfish desires. The jury convicted Lydia Hale of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and arson. They convicted Caleb Moore of the same charges despite his cooperation, recognizing that testimony given to save oneself doesn't erase participation in murder. Lydia received life without parole. Caleb received life with the possibility of parole after 40 years, a distinction that will only matter if he lives into his 80s. Both will spend the rest of their meaningful lives in prison, and Marcus Hale's children will grow up knowing that their stepmother valued insurance money more than their father's life. Emily Rowan's case represents something even more insidious than rage or greed. It represents predation disguised as kindness. Victor Lane's grooming of Emily was textbook in its progression. He'd started with small favors, normalizing his presence in her life. He'd given gifts that seemed generous but were actually investments, creating a sense of obligation and debt. He'd gradually pushed boundaries, testing how much access she'd allow, how much trust she'd extend. And he'd done all of this while maintaining the facade of a helpful neighbor, someone Emily's parents had no reason to distrust. The gift-giving deserves particular attention because it's such a common grooming tactic. Predators use gifts to create several psychological effects simultaneously. First, gifts generate goodwill and positive associations. Emily thought of Victor as generous, kind, someone who cared about her goals. Second, gifts create obligation. There's a subtle social pressure to reciprocate kindness, to not seem ungrateful, to maintain the relationship with someone who's been so nice. Third, gifts provide cover for increasingly inappropriate behavior. If questioned about why he's spending time with a teenage neighbor, Victor could point to the pet care arrangement, the gifts as payment for services, everything appearing above board. The isolation aspect of grooming is also worth examining. Victor had created situations where Emily was alone with him, where no one else could observe their interactions or serve as a check on his behavior. The pet care jobs meant Emily was in Victor's house, in his space, on his terms. The additional tasks he assigned her, watering plants, checking on repairs, extended that alone time. By the time Emily went to Victor's house on the night she disappeared, being alone with him had been normalized through dozens of previous interactions. She had no reason to think this visit would be different from all the others. What happened in Victor's garage that night will haunt Emily's parents forever. The confession Victor eventually gave was clinical and self-serving, full of passive language designed to minimize his culpability. He described making advances when what he meant was sexual assault. He described Emily reacting badly when what he meant was that a 17-year-old girl was terrified and trying to escape. He described a struggle when what he meant was murder. Victor tried to make it sound like things had gotten out of hand, like he'd panicked and made a terrible mistake. But his actions after Emily's death told a different story. Victor had transported Emily's body from the garage to a pre-dug grave in his backyard. Not a hastily dug hole, a pre-dug grave. That detail alone destroys any claim of panicked reaction. At some point before Emily arrived that night, Victor had gone into his backyard with a shovel and dug a grave deep enough to bury a body. He'd known what he was planning. He'd prepared for it. When Emily rejected his advances and tried to leave, Victor hadn't panicked. He'd executed a plan he'd already formed. The staging of Emily's car at the rest stop showed similar premeditation. Victor had driven her car there himself, wiping down surfaces, leaving her phone and purse to suggest she'd left voluntarily. He'd chosen a location far enough away to redirect the investigation, to make it seem like Emily had run away rather than been killed. He'd thought through the logistics, considered what investigators would think, tried to construct a narrative that would protect him. None of this is consistent with panic or accident. All of it is consistent with deliberate, calculated murder. Emily's parents had to sit through testimony describing their daughter's final moments. They had to hear how she'd trusted Victor, how she'd gone to his house expecting a routine job, how she'd fought for her life when she realized his true intentions. They had to hear Victor's defense attorney suggest that Emily had somehow encouraged his attention, that she'd been flirtatious or provocative, that she bore some responsibility for what happened to her. These suggestions were baseless and cruel, refuted by every person who knew Emily, but defense attorneys in cases like this often resort to victim blaming when they have no other strategy. The prosecution brought in an expert on grooming and predatory behavior who explained to the jury how Victor's actions fit a classic pattern. The expert testified about how predators target vulnerable young people, how they build trust over time, how they create situations of isolation and obligation. The expert explained that Emily's acceptance of gifts and her willingness to be alone with Victor weren't signs of inappropriate behavior on her part. They were signs that Victor's grooming had worked exactly as he'd intended it to. Emily had trusted Victor because he'd systematically built that trust. Her trust wasn't a failure of judgment. It was the intended outcome of deliberate manipulation. The jury convicted Victor Lane quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, his confession detailed, his guilt undeniable. The sentencing phase focused not on whether Victor should go to prison, but on whether he'd ever deserve the possibility of release. The judge ultimately decided that someone who premeditates the murder of a teenager, who grooms and manipulates to create opportunity, who shows such callous disregard for human life, should never be free again. Life without parole. Victor Lane will die in prison. Emily Rowan will remain 17 forever, buried in a cemetery instead of building the life she dreamed of. The Rowan family has become advocates for awareness about grooming and predatory behavior. They speak at schools and community events, sharing Emily's story to help other parents recognize warning signs. They talk about how gifts from adults to children should always be transparent and appropriate. How isolation of young people from oversight is a red flag. How teenagers need to know that they can reject adult attention without being rude, that their safety matters more than politeness. It's painful work, reliving their daughter's death over and over to prevent similar tragedies. But they do it because they believe Emily's death should mean something beyond just one family's grief. The Whitmore case operates on a completely different scale from the intimate betrayals of the other cases. This wasn't about personal relationships gone wrong. This was about systemic corruption, about power wielded without accountability for so long that it began to seem permanent. The Whitmore family had convinced themselves, and much of Lowland County, that they existed outside normal rules, that their name and their money and their connections made them untouchable. Richard Whitmore's biography reads like a manual on how power corrupts incrementally. He hadn't started as a murderer. He'd started as a young attorney from a prominent family, leveraging connections to build a successful practice. But each time he used influence inappropriately, a favor called in here, a case fixed there, a witness pressured into silence, it became easier to do it again. Each successful manipulation of the system reinforced his belief that rules didn't apply to him. By the time he reached the point of committing murder, he'd already crossed so many ethical and legal lines that killing his wife and son probably seemed like just another problem to be managed through the same tactics that had worked before. The business partner who died in the accidental fall from his roof had discovered financial irregularities in a joint venture with Richard. According to later investigations, The man had been preparing to go to authorities with evidence of fraud when he died. His death was ruled accidental because no one could prove otherwise, because the Whitmore name made people reluctant to look too closely, because Richard had enough influence with the local medical examiner to ensure the investigation was cursory at best. That death bought Richard time and silence. It also taught him that murder could be an effective solution to certain problems. The employee who died in the single-vehicle car accident had been a paralegal in a Whitmore-affiliated law firm. She'd stumbled across billing fraud, clients being charged for work that was never done, hours that were fabricated, expenses that were inflated or entirely fictional. She'd made the mistake of confronting Richard about it directly, giving him warning that she was a threat. The car accident that killed her happened on a road she drove every day, in weather conditions that weren't unusual. But investigators who reviewed the case years later found evidence that her vehicle had been tampered with, brake lines that showed signs of intentional damage, maintenance records that had been altered after the fact. By the time this evidence came to light, Richard was already facing murder charges for killing Catherine and Michael, so he was never formally charged for the paralegal's death. But the implication was clear. The distant Whitmore relative who'd supposedly overdosed had been fighting with Richard over estate distributions. She'd claimed, correctly, that Richard had used his position as executor of various family trusts to siphon money for his own use. She'd been preparing a lawsuit that would have required detailed financial disclosures and audits. Her death was ruled an accidental overdose because she was found with pills near her body and because she'd allegedly been depressed. But people who knew her insisted she'd been in good spirits, focused on her lawsuit, looking forward to holding Richard accountable. And later forensic analysis suggested the pills found with her body didn't match the prescriptions in her medical records, raising the possibility she'd been forcibly drugged. These deaths, spread over years, might have remained separate tragedies, unfortunate coincidences in the orbit of a powerful family. But once investigators started examining Richard's life in detail after the murders of Catherine and Michael, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Each victim had been threatening to expose Richard's corruption. Each death had been ruled in ways that foreclosed investigation. And each ruling had been made by officials who had connections to the Whitmore family, who owed favors, who had reason to not look too closely. The murders of Catherine and Michael Whitmore were different from Richard's previous crimes in one crucial way. They were messy. Richard had gotten away with previous murders because he'd made them look like accidents, because he'd maintained plausible deniability, because he'd had time to plan and prepare. But Catherine and Michael's deaths came in a moment of crisis, when Richard's control was slipping and he made a decision driven more by desperation than calculation. Michael's hit and run of the college student had triggered a series of events Richard couldn't fully control. Despite his best efforts to protect Michael, to suppress evidence, to pressure prosecutors, the case was gaining attention. National media was covering it. Advocacy groups were demanding justice. The student's family had hired high-profile attorneys who weren't intimidated by the Whitmore name. Richard was facing the real possibility that Michael would be convicted, that the case would expose the family's corruption, that everything Richard had built would collapse. Catherine had been deteriorating mentally under the stress. She'd started drinking heavily, making statements to friends that suggested she knew more about Richard's activities than she'd previously admitted. She'd told one friend that she was tired of lying, that she couldn't keep living like this. Richard had intercepted that conversation and realized Catherine was becoming a liability. She knew too much, she was too unstable, and she was no longer willing to maintain the silence that had protected the family for decades. Michael had also become a liability beyond just the hit and run. He'd started talking to federal investigators who were looking into Whitmore business practices. He'd apparently decided that cooperation might be his best chance at a reduced sentence, and he was willing to give up his father to save himself. Richard had learned about Michael's meetings with federal agents through his own sources in law enforcement, more evidence of how deeply the Whitmores had penetrated local systems. And Richard had made a calculation. If Michael was going to betray the family, he needed to be silenced permanently. The plan was simple in concept. Richard would kill both Catherine and Michael, stage it to look like Michael had killed his mother and then himself, and use his alibi to distance himself from the scene. The alibi was elaborate. Business meetings in the state capitol, hotel records, witnesses who'd been paid to confirm his presence. It should have worked. In the past, similar schemes had worked. But Richard made mistakes born from arrogance and desperation. The digital evidence that undermined Richard's alibi was irrefutable. Cell phone towers don't lie. They record which phones connected to which towers and when. Richard's phone, the one he'd claimed was with him at the Capitol, had actually pinged towers near his estate during the time of the murders. Richard's explanation, that he'd left his phone behind accidentally, might have been believable if not for other digital evidence. His car's GPS system recorded a trip from the estate to the Capitol after the murders, suggesting he'd driven there to establish his alibi. Security cameras at the hotel he'd claimed to stay at showed him checking in hours after he'd claimed to arrive. The financial evidence revealed the extent of Richard's desperation. He'd moved money into offshore accounts in the weeks before the murders. He'd liquidated assets and converted them to forms that would be harder to trace. He'd even purchased a property in a non-extradition country under a false name. All of this suggested that Richard had been planning to flee, that he'd known his empire was collapsing and had decided to cut his losses and to eliminate witnesses before making his escape. The trial of Richard Whitmore was a media sensation. Here was a man who'd represented everything powerful and untouchable in Lowland County, sitting in a defendant's chair, facing the same justice system he'd manipulated for decades. The courthouse where he'd once practiced law, where family members had served as judges, where the Whitmore name had been spoken with deference. That courthouse became the site of his public humiliation and conviction. The prosecution's case was overwhelming not just because of the evidence against Richard for Catherine and Michael's murders, but because of everything it exposed about decades of corruption. Witnesses testified about bribes paid, evidence suppressed, cases fixed. Documents showed financial fraud on a massive scale. Former Whitmore associates, now cooperating to save themselves, described a family-run criminal enterprise that had used the veneer of respectability to commit crimes with impunity. Richard's defense was hamstrung by his own arrogance. He insisted on testifying, believing he could talk his way out of conviction the way he'd talked his way out of accountability throughout his life. But on the witness stand, faced with evidence he couldn't explain and cross-examination he couldn't manipulate, Richard's facade cracked. He became defensive, angry, revealing the entitled narcissist beneath the professional exterior. The jury watched him lose his composure, watched him sneer at questions and condescend to prosecutors, and they saw clearly who he really was. The conviction came swiftly. 2 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and corruption. The sentencing hearing lasted an entire day, with victims of Whitmore corruption given the opportunity to speak. The families of the suspicious deaths that had never been prosecuted spoke. Business partners who'd been defrauded spoke. County residents who'd been harmed by corrupted systems spoke. It was a reckoning decades in the making. The judge's sentencing statement was scathing. He spoke about how Richard Whitmore had betrayed every oath he'd ever taken, had corrupted institutions meant to serve justice, had used power not to help his community, but to exploit it. He spoke about Catherine and Michael Whitmore, about how even family bonds meant nothing to a man who valued only control and self-preservation. The judge sentenced Richard to life in prison without possibility of parole on each murder count, to be served consecutively. Even if one conviction were somehow overturned, Richard would die in prison on the strength of the other. He would never again know freedom, never again wield power, never again corrupt the systems he'd spent his life manipulating. The fall of the Whitmore dynasty had ripple effects throughout Lowland County. Cases were reopened and reviewed. Officials who'd been in Whitmore pockets were investigated, and many were prosecuted. The legal system underwent reforms designed to prevent similar corruption. The Whitmore estate, once a symbol of untouchable power, was seized and eventually torn down. The land sold to pay restitution to victims of family crimes. Where the estate had stood, there's now a community park. The Whitmore name, once spoken with deference, is now synonymous with corruption and abuse of power. Richard Whitmore's fall proves something important. Power built on corruption is ultimately unstable. It can last for years, even generations. It can seem permanent and untouchable, but it requires constant maintenance, constant suppression of truth, constant elimination of threats. And eventually, whether through a mistake or through sheer weight of accumulated evidence or through the courage of people who refuse to stay silent, that power collapses. Richard believed he'd created something lasting. Instead, he created something that destroyed itself and took him down with it. Nathan Cole's case brings us back to the scale of individual tragedy, but with a complexity that makes it particularly fascinating from an investigative standpoint. The locked room mystery has been a staple of detective fiction for over a century, but when it happens in real life, when investigators are faced with a genuine impossible crime, the intellectual challenge is matched by the weight of knowing that a real person is dead and someone needs to be held accountable. Detective Leon Marks described the Nathan Cole case as the most frustrating of his career, at least in the early years before the weapon was discovered. Every murder leaves evidence. That's a fundamental principle of forensic science. Contact leaves traces. Movement leaves patterns. Violence leaves signs. But in Nathan's apartment, there seemed to be no evidence of anyone else having been there. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. No DNA from anyone but Nathan. No fingerprints that shouldn't have been there. The locked doors and windows weren't picked or tampered with. They'd been locked normally, from the inside, with Nathan's keys still in the apartment. The lack of a weapon was initially assumed to be the result of someone staging the scene, of the killer taking the gun with them when they left. But that theory didn't explain how the killer had left through locked doors and windows. Could someone have locked the doors from outside using a spare key? Nathan's keys were all accounted for, and the locks showed no signs of picking. Could someone have been hiding in the apartment when Nathan arrived home, killed him, and then somehow locked themselves out? The apartment wasn't large. There were no hiding places that wouldn't have been obvious during the search. Leon Marks spent months exploring every possibility, no matter how unlikely. Could Nathan have been shot from outside through a window? The angles didn't work, and the windows were all intact. Could someone have accessed the apartment through ventilation ducts or plumbing? The complex wasn't constructed in a way that would allow that. Could Nathan have been killed elsewhere and his body transported to the apartment? The forensic evidence of blood spatter and tissue damage showed conclusively he died where he was found. The investigation into Nathan's personal life revealed a man who'd made a lot of people angry, but no one angry enough to commit murder in such an elaborate way. The women he'd been involved with were hurt, betrayed, frustrated, but interviews and polygraphs suggested none of them had killed him. Friends described Nathan as charming but shallow, someone who kept relationships superficial. Coworkers knew him as competent and likable, but not close. He had no serious financial problems, no gambling debts, no involvement in anything criminal. He was just a guy living a modern urban life, dating casually, working his sales job, existing without making major waves. Except for Rachel Monroe. Rachel's interviews with police had been consistent on the surface. She and Nathan had dated. It had ended badly. She was hurt, but had moved on. But something about Rachel's effect during those interviews bothered Leon Marks. She was too calm, too controlled, especially compared to the emotional messages she'd sent Nathan before his death. And her alibi, while solid, relied entirely on her own statement that she'd been in her apartment alone. No one had seen her. No one could confirm her whereabouts. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Leon circling back to her. The discovery of the weapon 3 years later was pure chance. If that drainage problem hadn't happened, if the plumber had been less thorough, if Rachel had chosen a different hiding place, the gun might never have been found. But chance favors the persistent, and Leon Marks had maintained pressure on the case in ways that made the lucky break mean something. He'd kept the evidence fresh in his mind. He'd maintained relationships with forensic specialists who could test the weapon when it appeared. He'd preserved the crime scene documentation in ways that allowed him to match the weapon to the murder immediately. The revelation that Rachel had shot Nathan through the wall was both simple and brilliant. Simple in execution, point gun at wall, pull trigger. Brilliant in conception. It solved all the problems that had made the case seem impossible. No need to be in Nathan's apartment. No need to worry about locked doors. No need to stage anything. Just kill him from the safety of your own space and wait for someone else to find the body. The reconstruction of the crime showed how Rachel had planned it. She'd learned Nathan's routines, knew when he was likely to be home, knew where he typically sat. She'd tested the wall to understand its thickness, had calculated where to position herself. On the night of the murder, she'd waited until she heard Nathan return home, had given him time to settle into his usual spot on the couch, and had fired through the wall. The bullet had passed through drywall, through insulation, through more drywall, and into Nathan Cole's chest, killing him within minutes. Rachel's confession, when it finally came, was delivered with a coldness that shocked investigators who'd been working the case. She showed no remorse for killing Nathan, no recognition that what she'd done was wrong. Instead, she talked about how Nathan had deserved it, how he'd humiliated her, how he'd made her feel worthless. She talked about planning the murder as if it were a creative project, something she'd worked on and refined. She talked about the satisfaction of knowing Nathan was dead and that no one would ever figure out she'd done it. The only emotion she showed was frustration that she'd been caught, that her perfect crime had been undone by something as mundane as a maintenance issue. The psychological evaluation of Rachel Monroe, conducted as part of her defense team's preparation, revealed a personality marked by extreme narcissism and an inability to process rejection in healthy ways. The psychologist who evaluated her noted that Rachel viewed other people primarily as sources of validation. When Nathan had provided that validation, she'd been content. When he'd withdrawn it, she'd experienced not just hurt, but rage at what she perceived as a fundamental injustice. In Rachel's worldview, Nathan had no right to end their relationship, no right to pursue other women, no right to exist if he wasn't going to exist in relation to her. This psychological profile helps explain the nature of Rachel's crime, but doesn't excuse it. Millions of people experience rejection and heartbreak without resorting to murder. Millions of people have narcissistic tendencies without becoming violent. Rachel's psychological issues may have contributed to her decision to kill Nathan, but they didn't cause that decision. She'd had options at every point: to accept the breakup and move on, to seek therapy for her emotional struggles, to channel her anger into productive rather than destructive outlets. She'd chosen murder because on some level, she'd decided it was an acceptable solution to her problem. The trial hinged on whether Rachel could be held legally responsible for her actions given her mental state. Her defense team argued that her psychological issues diminished her capacity to form intent, that she'd acted in a dissociative state brought on by emotional trauma. But the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation: the stolen gun, the false police report, the calculation of angles, the patience to wait for the right moment. This wasn't someone acting in an emotional fugue state. This was someone who'd made a plan and executed it over a period of months. The jury's decision to convict Rachel of first-degree murder sent a clear message: rejection doesn't justify violence. Hurt feelings don't excuse murder. And planning a crime for months demonstrates exactly the kind of intent that the law requires for the most serious charges. Rachel Monroe was sentenced to life in prison with possibility of parole after 25 years. If she ever gets out, she'll be in her 60s, having spent her entire adult life incarcerated. Nathan Cole will still be dead, and the locked room mystery that seemed impossible to solve will remain a cautionary tale about persistence, luck, and the importance of never giving up on justice. These 5 cases, separated by geography and circumstance, connected by common threads of betrayal and violence, serve as more than just true crime stories. They're lessons about human nature, about the systems we've built to pursue justice, about the consequences of trust misplaced and power corrupted. Let's take a moment to reflect on what these stories teach us and what they mean for how we navigate a world where violence can hide behind the most ordinary faces. The first lesson is about the invisibility of danger. None of these murderers announced their intentions clearly. Elena Cross was a respected military officer up until the night she killed her husband. Lydia Hale and Caleb Moore were unremarkable community members before they became killers. Victor Lane was the helpful neighbor for years before he revealed himself as a predator. Richard Whitmore was a prominent attorney from a powerful family, trusted by many. Rachel Monroe was just a woman dealing with heartbreak. If we're waiting for murderers to look or act like monsters, we'll miss them every time. The truth is that people who commit terrible acts often look exactly like everyone else, which is precisely what makes them so dangerous. This doesn't mean we should become paranoid or suspicious of everyone around us. It means we should pay attention to patterns of behavior rather than surface appearances. Elena Cross had been escalating conflicts with Daniel for months. Lydia Hale had been making suspicious financial moves. Victor Lane had been grooming Emily systematically. Richard Whitmore had left a trail of suspicious deaths and corruption. Rachel Monroe had been displaying increasingly obsessive behavior. In each case, There were warning signs, small behaviors that, when viewed in aggregate, suggested something wrong. The challenge is that we're not always looking for those patterns, and even when we see them, we're not always sure what they mean or what to do about them. The second lesson is about the limitations and strengths of our justice system. In Daniel Cross's case, police responded to wellness checks but couldn't intervene without evidence of immediate danger, a limitation that prioritizes civil liberties but can leave vulnerable people unprotected. In Marcus Hale's case, investigators recognized staging immediately and built a case that led to conviction, a success story of forensic science and persistent investigation. In Emily Rowan's case, the community's trust in a longtime neighbor delayed suspicion, a reminder that predators often hide in plain sight. In Richard Whitmore's case, corruption had compromised the system for decades before finally being exposed, a demonstration of how power can subvert justice until someone has the courage to challenge it. In Nathan Cole's case, an unsolvable mystery was solved through a combination of detective persistence and random chance, a reminder that justice sometimes requires both skill and luck. These cases show that our justice system, imperfect as it is, can work when investigators are diligent, when forensic science is applied carefully, when prosecutors build solid cases, and when juries take their responsibilities seriously. But they also show the system's vulnerabilities to corruption, to incomplete evidence, to the difficulty of proving crimes that are carefully planned and executed. The question isn't whether the system is perfect, because it isn't. The question is whether we're willing to continually improve it, to learn from cases where it fails, and to support the people working within it who are genuinely committed to justice. The third lesson is about the permanent damage that violence causes. Daniel Cross's children lost both parents in one night and will carry that trauma for life. Marcus Hale's children had to process not just their father's death, but the knowledge that their stepmother had killed him for money. Emily Rowan's parents lost their daughter and live with grief that will never fully heal. The Lowland County community lost trust in institutions that had governed them for generations. Nathan Cole's family spent 3 years not knowing who'd killed their son or why. These wounds don't close. Convictions provide a measure of closure, sentences provide a form of justice, but nothing restores what was taken. This is why prevention matters more than prosecution. Every case we've discussed tonight ended with convictions and sentences. The justice system worked in that sense. But the victims are still dead. The families are still grieving. The communities are still traumatized. If we can identify warning signs earlier, if we can intervene before violence occurs, if we can provide resources that help people resolve conflicts without resorting to murder, we save lives and spare families the kind of permanent damage that no verdict can undo. The fourth lesson is about the importance of speaking up. In several of these cases, people noticed concerning behaviors but didn't report them because they seemed too minor, too ambiguous, or because speaking up felt awkward or inappropriate. Neighbors heard arguments at the Cross house but didn't want to intrude. Friends noticed Richard Whitmore's controlling behavior toward his wife but assumed it was none of their business. People who interacted with Victor Lane might have sensed something off about his interest in Emily, but didn't have concrete evidence to justify their discomfort. This isn't about encouraging paranoia or false accusations. It's about trusting our instincts when something feels wrong and seeking appropriate help. If you're concerned about domestic violence, call a hotline. If you're worried about a teenager being groomed, talk to parents or school counselors. If you notice suspicious behaviors, report them to police. Most reports won't lead to dramatic interventions, and that's okay. But some will, and those interventions might save lives. The cost of speaking up when something turns out to be nothing is minimal. The cost of staying silent when something is genuinely wrong can be devastating. If you've stayed with us through this entire video, thank you. These aren't easy stories to hear, and I know that true crime content can be emotionally draining. But I believe these stories matter, not for their shock value, but for what they teach us about preventing future tragedies. The fifth and perhaps most important lesson is that violence is always a choice. Elena Cross chose to shoot Daniel rather than pursue divorce or separation. Lydia Hale and Caleb Moore chose to murder Marcus rather than simply being together without him. Victor Lane chose to kill Emily rather than accept her rejection. Richard Whitmore chose to murder his wife and son rather than face accountability for his crimes. Rachel Monroe chose to shoot Nathan rather than process her heartbreak in healthy ways. At every decision point, these killers had alternatives. They chose violence because on some level, they decided it served their interests better than any other option. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge because it means we can't easily categorize murderers as fundamentally different from us. They're not aliens or monsters. They're people who made terrible choices, who valued their own desires or security or pride more than other people's lives. And that means any of us, theoretically, could make similar choices if we prioritize the wrong things, if we refuse to accept consequences, if we decide that what we want matters more than human life. The difference between people who commit murder and people who don't isn't always about mental illness or childhood trauma or sociopathy. Sometimes it's just about choosing differently at crucial moments. But while we acknowledge that violence is a choice, we should also acknowledge the factors that can make that choice more likely. Untreated mental illness doesn't cause violence in most cases, but it can impair judgment in ways that make violence more probable. Substance abuse doesn't excuse criminal behavior, but it can lower inhibitions and increase impulsivity. Financial desperation doesn't justify theft or fraud or murder, but it can create pressures that lead people to make choices they wouldn't otherwise consider. Rejection and heartbreak don't warrant violent responses, but they can trigger emotional states that require management and support. The point isn't to excuse violence or to shift responsibility away from people who choose to harm others. The point is to recognize that prevention involves addressing risk factors, providing support systems, and creating off-ramps before people reach the point where violence seems like an option. Daniel Cross needed better mental health support and conflict resolution resources. Marcus Hale needed a justice system that couldn't be manipulated by money. Emily Rowan needed education about grooming and parents who understood predatory patterns. Lowland County needed institutions resistant to corruption. Nathan Cole's situation needed early intervention when Rachel's behavior became concerning. These aren't simple problems with simple solutions, but they're problems worth working on. Every murder prevented is a life saved, a family spared, a community protected from trauma. Let's talk specifically about what individuals can do with the awareness these cases provide. If you're in a relationship where arguments are escalating, where you feel unsafe, where your partner makes threats even if they seem non-serious, take those signs seriously. Document concerning behaviors. Reach out to domestic violence resources. Make a safety plan. Tell trusted people what's happening. Don't convince yourself that things will get better on their own, or that love will solve problems rooted in control or anger. If you have teenagers, talk to them about grooming and predatory behavior. Explain that adults who give gifts or create situations of isolation may have inappropriate motives. Teach them that they never owe anyone access or attention regardless of kindness received. Create an environment where they can come to you with concerns without fear of punishment or judgment. Trust your instincts if an adult's interest in your child feels excessive or inappropriate. If you're part of a community where certain people or families seem untouchable, where complaints are dismissed because of who's being complained about, where justice seems to depend on wealth or connections, challenge that. Support reforms that increase transparency and accountability. Vote for officials who prioritize integrity over influence. Speak up when you see corruption, even when it's uncomfortable or socially costly to do so. If you're concerned about someone's mental health, especially if they're showing signs of obsession or an inability to accept rejection, encourage them to seek professional help. If they resist, consider reporting concerning behaviors to appropriate authorities. Don't convince yourself that it's not your business or that the person would never actually do anything dangerous. Many violent acts are preceded by warning signs that people noticed but didn't act on. And if you're struggling with thoughts of violence, with rage you can't control, with fantasies about harming people who've hurt you, please seek help immediately. Call a crisis hotline. Go to an emergency room. Tell someone you trust. Violence doesn't solve problems. It creates new and permanent ones. The temporary satisfaction of revenge or the relief of eliminating a problem is not worth spending your life in prison, destroying families, and living with the knowledge that you've killed someone. There are always alternatives, always off-ramps, always ways forward that don't involve hurting others. These cases also highlight the importance of supporting the people who work to solve crimes and pursue justice. Detectives like Leon Marks, who spend years on cold cases when they could move on to easier work. prosecutors who build careful cases even when evidence is challenging, forensic specialists who apply science to find truth, advocates who support victims' families through impossibly difficult trials. These people do work that's emotionally draining, often thankless, and absolutely essential. When we support funding for police training, for forensic laboratories, for victim services, for court systems, we're supporting the infrastructure that makes justice possible. We should also acknowledge the people who testified in these trials despite fear or discomfort, neighbors who reported concerning behaviors, friends who shared information even when it meant betraying confidences, experts who explained complex evidence to juries, family members who faced defendants in court to describe the impact of their crimes. These acts of courage and civic responsibility make our justice system function. They deserve recognition and gratitude. As we close this examination of 5 cases across different contexts, but connected by common threads, I want to emphasize that true crime content serves a purpose beyond entertainment. Yes, these stories are compelling in their drama and complexity. Yes, they satisfy a natural human curiosity about darkness and danger. But they're also educational. They teach us about warning signs, about justice processes, about human nature at its worst and sometimes at its best. When we engage with these stories thoughtfully rather than sensationally, when we honor victims by learning from their tragedies, we transform true crime from exploitation into something more meaningful. Daniel Cross, Marcus Hale, Emily Rowan, Catherine and Michael Whitmore, and Nathan Cole. These weren't just case numbers or plot points in dramatic stories. They were real people with lives and loved ones and futures that were stolen from them. The least we can do is remember them not just as victims, but as individuals whose deaths should matter beyond the courtroom verdicts. If you found this deep dive into 5 interconnected cases valuable, if you learned something about warning signs or justice processes or human behavior, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Comments are open for respectful discussion about these cases, about what they teach us, about how we can work toward preventing similar tragedies. But please keep comments respectful. Remember that these are real cases involving real people whose families may read what you write. Thank you for spending these hours with me, for engaging seriously with difficult content, for caring about justice and truth and prevention. These stories are hard to hear, but they're important to understand. The world contains violence and betrayal, yes, but it also contains people dedicated to fighting those things, to supporting survivors, to building systems that protect the vulnerable. By understanding the darkness, we can better appreciate and support the light. In future videos, we'll continue exploring cases that teach us something important, that honor victims by learning from their stories, that highlight both the failures and successes of our justice system. But for now, let these 5 cases serve as reminders. Trust must be earned and maintained, not assumed. Warning signs deserve attention, not dismissal. Justice requires persistence, not just hope. And every life lost to violence represents not just a tragedy, but a failure we should work to prevent in the future. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel threatened or concerned about someone's safety, trust those instincts and reach out for help. Your vigilance could save a life. Your silence could cost one. The choice, as always, is yours. Until next time, this is Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories, reminding you that the most important story is the one we write together when we choose to protect rather than harm, to speak up rather than stay silent, to pursue justice rather than accept corruption. These 5 cases ended in courtrooms and prison cells. Let's work together to prevent the next 5 from ever beginning. Good night, and may justice always find its way home.